Changing focus. Democrats have placed a priority on voting legislation and hint they may seek to change rules in the Senate. We're on Capitol Hill. Deadly fire. Pope Francis is among those mourning the victims of yesterday's apartment blaze in the Bronx, the deadliest in New York City in decades. Baptism of the Lord. The Holy Father brings a tradition back to the Vatican following a one-year break. And Eye on the Galaxy. New developments in the $10 billion James Webb Space Telescope and its trip into space. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, January 10th, 2022. Thank you so much for being with us tonight on this feast of St. Gregory of Nyssa. I'm Tracy Sable. Senate Democrats are eager to see a win on an issue they warn could have long-term consequences for U.S. democracy. A pair of voting rights bills are on the agenda, and they are pushing to pass them this week, even if it means the rules in the Senate are changing. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales has more.
On the heels of the president and vice president's trip this week to Georgia to sell Americans on voting rights reform, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says Republicans have a choice.
They can follow in the footsteps of our patriotic predecessors in this chamber, or they can sit by, just as the segregationist-oriented Democrats in the post-Civil War era did, and try to have democracy unravel.
But Republicans tell me these bills would amount to a government takeover of the election process.
They've been looking for a reason to pass the federalization of election laws for a long time. I'll just point out that Georgia, who they're complaining about, has more liberal election laws than Delaware, President Biden's home state.
The two voting rights bills include the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would restore the power of the federal government to oversee state voting laws, and the Freedom to Vote Act, which brings broad changes to election and campaign finance laws. It makes Election Day a public holiday, mandates same-day voter registration, requires states to offer 15 consecutive days of early voting, allows all voters to request mail-in ballots, and restores voting rights to felons. Senator Tim Kaine says similar changes were made by the Democrat-controlled Virginia legislature, and it worked in last November's governor election.
When Democrats did that, turnout went up by 25%. And the winner wasn't a Democrat, the winner was a Republican. Doing things like the Freedom to Vote Act isn't partisan, even though the vote in here may be partisan, it's good for all.
But passing the bills would require changes to Senate debate rules, like requiring only 50 votes to pass bills in the Senate, something that no Republican is willing to support.
They have this partisan agenda they're trying to jam through Congress. All of a sudden they decide to blow up the rules to try and do it. If they do it, it will be the end of the Senate as we know it.
The majority leader wants a vote this week on the proposed changes. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
And joining me now to discuss is Christopher Bedford, senior editor at the Federalist and co-founder of Right Forward. Chris, welcome back. Always great to see you. Let's talk a little bit more about these voting rights bills and why do you think Democrats are so eager to get them passed this week?
I think part of what we're seeing from the Democrats right now is just some election posturing, them trying to create an image they can push now in the elections coming forward and put themselves on the side of Martin Luther King, as they're going to do. You're going to see President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris going down to Georgia this week, where they're going to visit the tomb of Martin Luther King. They're going to visit the church that he preached at. They're going to go to a lot of the different places where the segregation battle was. And you can see Chuck Schumer there earlier just laying this out and saying this is a battle against segregation. Of course, that has no basis in fact at all, but it is politicking. It's the kind of thing that you can kind of expect from these folks pushing forward. My thing is, I don't think that they've got the votes to do this. Unless they can get Manchin and Sinema on board, which they do not have for getting rid of the filibuster, they might not have the votes to do this. So it's probably just a lot of party posturing to try and get some wins on the board for Democrats to run on in the midterms.
You know, that said, Chris, talk to us about the consequences of the federal government having influence over states in their elections.
Well, we've seen so far in the last election that it was basically the most breakdowns of barriers that we've ever had in this country to protecting the integrity of elections. We're at a dangerous place right now in this country where neither Democrats nor Republicans seem to trust the election results and are always are quick to anger when the elections don't go their way. the federal government's meddling, the federal government making the election day longer and longer and longer, getting more involved, that does not bode well for the trust the American people already are losing in these elections. It's been something they've been trying to do, and they've had a lot of successes over the past couple of years. But I think the chaos that we saw after the 2020 election should make folks want to think twice about meddling further and further and breaking down barriers to voting like they have been in New York City and other places.
Yeah, speaking of New York, I want to talk about that. The new mayor, Eric Adams, has green-lighted a bill allowing non-citizens who have green cards and work permits to vote in municipal elections as long as they have been living in the city for 30 days. Your thoughts on this, Chris?
I think Jake Tapper was right. I rarely agree with him, but when he challenged the mayor on CNN saying this just makes a mockery of a citizenry. What exactly is it to be a U.S. citizen? What is the privilege? It comes with understanding our system of government, having been either raised here or having waited in line and gone through those exams, taking an oath of allegiance to the United States, and then being able to have a voice in how we govern ourselves. It's a very strange idea that people from other countries should have a say in what the people in this country govern themselves. It's one of the reasons we fought the American Revolution, the main reason we fought the American Revolution. And it just makes a mockery of the entire process and those people who were either born here and are citizens, or those people who waited in line and legally became citizens.
Chris, I'm going to turn now to something that Justice Sotomayor said on Friday that really landed her in a bit of hot water. She claimed that more than 100,000 children were in the hospital with COVID, many of them on ventilators. Now, Sunday, while appearing on TV, CDC Director Rochelle Walensky corrected her, saying there were less than 3,500 children in the hospital with the virus. How do you think that Justice Sotomayor got those numbers so wrong? And let's talk about the danger in that.
I think it's from the massive disinformation campaign or the panic that we've been seeing from a lot of folks in the corporate media and a lot of politicians that are about this. I mean, here in Washington, D.C., where deaths are down, where COVID is up, but deaths are down, the hospitalizations related to because of COVID are not impactful. We're seeing more and more restrictions against us anyways because of the panic that's being pushed by folks. When I saw the amount of falsehoods that came out of some of the justices, Supreme Court justices' mouths relating to COVID, what that made me think about was if Supreme Court justices believe this stuff, believe these things which are demonstrably not true, then how difficult is it going to be to calm down the average voter who doesn't spend their entire life trying to just think these things over and understand the facts like a Supreme Court justice does? It made me worry for the amount of disinformation that's already set in and caused this panic in the first place.
All right, before I let you go, I want to talk about your latest column. You wrote about how big tech has become more bold in its censorship after Twitter banned former President Donald Trump last year. Talk to us more about that.
Well, we just had this past weekend was the anniversary of big tech deciding that the sitting president of the United States was no longer allowed to speak to his 90 million followers, as well as ripping out the internet infrastructure for Parler, just an alternative and a competitor to them. The year before that, we'd seen them censor the New York Post for embarrassing the Democratic candidate, and now we've seen them going after Christian activists in Texas to deplatform them. The big tech at one point in this country stood for decentralization, the sharing of information, bringing communities together. But for years and years now, and increasingly, they've just been an arm of the left who stand much more for control, much more for censorship. And Americans ought to wake up. There's a new economy forming, which I've been working on with Right Forge and a lot of other folks who are starting this to try and push back against this. But Americans should wake up. It's not going to get better with big tech. It's going to continue to get worse.
All right, Chris, we're going to leave it right there. Thank you so much for your time. Always appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, the world is watching to see if the Biden administration can prevent Russia from invading Ukraine. Today, senior U.S. and Russian officials met in Europe to try to calm things down. The White House warned Russia that it would pay dearly if thousands of its troops now on the border march in. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen?
Tracy, good evening to you. The good thing tonight is both sides are talking, right? But the big question mark is, will all that talking pay off, or has Russia already made up its mind to invade Ukraine?
President Joe Biden back at the White House today. He did not take any questions on his arrival, but there are plenty of them. Top among them, whether the talks in Geneva, Switzerland between the U.S. and Russia will prevent war. Today, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman and her Russian counterpart holding face-to-face talks. Russia demanding NATO does not expand, but the U.S. saying that is non-negotiable. In the press briefing room today, this assessment.
The aggressive action, the bellicose rhetoric came from the Russians, so they have the ability and the power to de-escalate.
There are more talks planned for later this week, including a NATO-Russia meeting. Still, the NATO Secretary General cautioned in Brussels today there will not be any fast solutions.
But I don't think we can expect that these meetings will solve all the issues. What we are hoping for is that we can agree on a way forward.
Meanwhile, the battle against COVID-19 rages on. Kids caught in the middle. In Chicago, another day of no school, the fourth day in a row. The dispute over pandemic protocols. In Indianapolis, the superintendent of schools there says kids at their desks is the best way to learn.
When we are able to have our students together with their peers and their teacher in person for learning, that's the best environment in which we can provide the instruction that they need.
Meanwhile, today is the day President Biden's controversial vaccine mandate kicks in for large companies.
But this mandate of OSHA, the federal government, needs to be struck down, and that's why we're fighting against it. And I expect the Supreme Court, hopefully, to rule against the Biden administration on that oppressive vaccine mandate.
Also tonight, a new Associated Press poll reveals that Americans are now more worried about the economy and inflation than they are about COVID-19, and that could pose a big problem for Democrats during the midterm elections later this year. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
A Bronx community in New York City is grieving after yesterday morning's apartment fire, which killed 19 people, including 9 children. The cause is pinpointed to a malfunctioning space heater in one unit, but subsequent smoke inhalation is blamed for the deaths and injuries. 13 of 44 people are still in critical condition. This morning, Pope Francis offered heartfelt condolences to New York's Cardinal Timothy Dolan for the victims and their families. Officials in India say Mother Teresa's charity can once again receive foreign donations. Several weeks ago, the government banned the Missionaries of Charity from accepting foreign funds. The charity runs hundreds of shelters that care for some of the neediest people in the world. The New York Times reports foreign donations last fiscal year totaled around $13 million. In Myanmar, also known as Burma, ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi has been sentenced to 4 more years in prison for possession of so-called illegal communication devices and for COVID-19 violations. She is already serving 1 suspended sentence and still faces more court battles as a result of last February's military coup. Well, the toll continues to mount from last week's turmoil in Kazakhstan, where more than 160 people were killed.
Казахстан, а по сути это нападение на страну, на Казахстан, по сути явилось актом.
Russian President Vladimir Putin said today that last week's security force deployment was temporary. Kazakhstan's president blames the demonstrations on terrorism rather than political discontent. Nearly 8,000 people have been detained from protests over fuel prices, which turned violent. Coming up, China battles a COVID-19 outbreak as the Winter Olympics draw near. Analysis from Gordon Chang. China detects its first case of the Omicron variant. The concern over the variant spreading has prompted mass COVID testing and a lockdown of a port city near Beijing. The government has created 3 levels of lockdowns, with the strictest banning individuals from leaving their homes. China has stepped up its strict zero-tolerance strategy as the 2022 Winter Olympics draw near. And joining me now is Gordon Chang, author of The Great U.S.-China Tech War and the Coming Collapse of China. Gordon, welcome back. Always so great to see you. We have a lot to get to, but first, I want to get your thoughts on these strict lockdowns and China's zero-tolerance policy, that is.
The presence of Omicron in Tianjin, which is Beijing's port city, must be of grave concern to the regime because they're concerned about the Olympics. The Olympics start on February 4th if they go ahead. Now, the International Olympic Committee has said, look, they are going to go forward as scheduled, but as China is unable to deal with the transmissions throughout the country, and they actually are quite severe, they could very well postpone the games, like they postponed the Summer Olympics from Tokyo from 2020 to last year.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you how you thought it would impact the Olympics. And also, I do want to get your thoughts, Gordon, on the Olympics still taking place despite China's human rights abuses.
Well, the International Olympic Committee is not concerned about that, as they should, but they should, because Right now, you have genocide, crimes against humanity, and other atrocities. We know that there are going to be extraordinarily strict lockdowns. Only Chinese tourists are allowed to go to the games. This is going to be the worst games ever. And the IOC should just postpone them and then eventually move them to a country that is just not tainted with these atrocities.
Yeah, another thing I want to talk about is China showing its support to Kazakhstan's government by offering to increase law enforcement and security following the unrest in that country. Talk to us more about that. And why do you think China wants to get involved? What's behind it?
China wants to get involved in Kazakhstan for so many reasons. First of all, the Russians are there. There's about 3,000 quote unquote peacekeepers that Moscow has sent. And China wants its own people there because they compete for influence in Kazakhstan. Remember, many of China's Belt and Road projects that connect the country to Europe actually go through Kazakhstan. And they're also concerned about the protests spreading because there is one people on both sides of the border between Kazakhstan and China. And they could very well spread protests into what China calls Xinjiang, the northwestern part of the country. And Beijing is concerned about that as well. So there's so many reasons that China wants to be there. But the Kazakh government has not accepted Chinese peacekeepers, and that is not going down very well in Beijing.
Yeah, another thing I want to talk about, we've talked about Taiwan before. In a New Year's message to China, Taiwan's president said that the military conflict will not resolve their issues. Beijing responded and threatened that if Taiwan crossed any lines, that it would lead to a profound catastrophe. Talk to us about that, and have we seen any type of escalation there's anymore?
Well, China's threats, especially last year, really only worked to stiffen the resolve of the people in Taiwan to defend themselves. So Beijing has now got to go to a point where either they're going to increase the threats or they're going to back down, because obviously what Beijing is doing right now is not working. People in Taiwan have come to the point of view that they have got to maintain their own sovereignty. They don't believe they're Chinese. When you look at self-identification surveys in Taiwan, about 80% of the people say they're Taiwanese, not Chinese. And the percentage of the people who see themselves as Chinese only is in the low single digits. So Beijing's got a real problem here, that everything it's doing is not working. So we got to really be worried that China is going to do something especially belligerent this coming year.
Yeah, and before we let you go, I want to talk also about Evergrande. And we brought this up other times before, but CNBC reported that Evergrande's debt issues are affecting the real estate market in China, saying that one of the healthier real estate developers has defaulted on repayment. What more do you know about that and the economic impact that Evergrande is having there and possibly around the world?
Yeah, Shimao, which is the developer that CNBC is talking about, actually announced just a few hours ago that it's going to sell all of its properties. And that led to an increase in its stock market value after a precipitous fall the day before. China right now is a problem in that its property developers face $197 billion in obligations this month. That's not only bonds, those are trust obligations, those are payments to workers and others. And this is going to be a crunch time, especially as property developers don't have the money to discharge their obligations. You know, Evergrande itself has been forced to destroy 39 buildings in Hainan. It's been forced to actually move its headquarters to cheaper premises. Evergrande is in a world of hurt. The one thing, though, that Beijing is trying to support it, but I don't think that they can really support it for that much longer because its debt obligations are much too high, about $305 billion.
And Gordon, also before we let you go, what else do you have your eye on? What else are you following, and what do you think is important for us to know?
Well, one of the things that hasn't gotten very much attention is that the Iranian foreign minister has announced a trip to Beijing to talk about their 25-year strategic partnership, which probably means that relations between Tehran and Beijing are not going very well at the moment. But obviously, China is supporting Iran. And this is of critical importance to us because Iran is negotiating with the international community in Europe about the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuke deal. So Beijing is in a position to actually cause a lot of mischief with regard to those negotiations.
Well, that's very concerning indeed. We'll keep our eye on that, and we know you will as well. Gordon, thank you so much for your time. Always appreciate talking to you.
Thank you, Tracy.
Up next, Pope Francis has a message about the importance of prayer. And exciting news from outer space. We'll explain. Pope Francis reminds the faithful the way to allow God into our hearts and our lives is through prayer.
Pregare è il modo per lasciare agire Dio in noi.
At his Sunday address to pilgrims at the Vatican, the Holy Father said prayer, quote, opens the heavens and will bring God's help to us even during our most stressful and difficult times. The Holy Father also prayed for a peaceful solution to the tension in Kazakhstan. The Holy Father brings back a tradition honoring the baptism of Christ.
Io te battesso nel nome del Padre, del Figlio e dello Spirito Santo.
At a Mass yesterday in the Sistine Chapel, the Holy Father baptized 16 babies. Pope St. John Paul II began the tradition back in 1981. Last year, it was canceled because of the coronavirus pandemic. Joining us now from Rome is Andreas Thonhauser, EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief. Andreas, great to see you. Can you tell us a little bit more about this baptism Mass?
Sure, Tracy, and thank you for having me. Well, as you know, yesterday we celebrated the feast marking Jesus' baptism. Here in the Vatican, it is an old and dear tradition that the Pope baptizes children in the Sistine Chapel. And last year, unfortunately, this had to be canceled due to COVID-19. Despite rising numbers right now in Italy, this year it was still possible for Pope Francis to baptize 16 newborns, 7 boys and 9 girls. It was a beautiful celebration amidst the gorgeous paintings of the Sistine Chapel. And in his brief homily, Pope Francis reminded us that the infants received their Christian identity through the sacrament of baptism. He also highlighted the role of parents and godparents. They're all called to support the baptized in deepening and preserving their Christian identity.
And I also understand this morning that Pope Francis met with the members of the diplomatic corps to the Holy See. What more can you tell us about that?
Sure. This is another famous tradition, the Holy Father's address to the ambassadors to the Holy See. Today, Pope Francis received the diplomatic corps, and in his address, he made 3 important points. First, he spoke about the current corona crisis and called for the availability of vaccines across the world, especially in the developing countries. Secondly, the Holy Father also addressed the topic of migration, recalling his recent visit to the island of Lesbos. In general, he asked all countries to be more welcoming to people looking for a new life. Speaking about the refugees he met, he reminded us that we cannot be indifferent or hide behind walls and barbed wires under the pretext of defending security or a certain style of life. Thirdly, Pope Francis encouraged new international efforts to ensure global peace. A particular goal is to rid the world of nuclear arms. He said that in the 21st century, nuclear arms are an inadequate and inappropriate means of responding to security threats, and that possession of them is ultimately immoral.
And also talking about the diplomatic corps at the Vatican, Andreas, can you share with us some numbers and details?
Of course, Tracy. Right now, there are 183 states that currently maintain diplomatic relations with the Holy See. In addition, there are the European Union and the Order of Malta. And we have 89 ambassadors to the Holy See right now residing in Rome. One of the more recently established embassies, for example, is the one of Palestine, which opened its doors on June 26th in 2015. It will soon be joined by the Swiss and the Azerbaijani embassy to the Holy See. At the same time, there are 13 nations with which the Holy See does not have full diplomatic relations. And standing out in this list is, for example, Afghanistan. There hasn't been even a functioning church since the return of the Taliban. But Tracy, to end on a more positive note, in his meeting with the diplomats, the Pope today stressed the importance of dialogue and diplomacy by quoting the prophet Jeremiah. He tells us that God has plans for welfare and not for evil.
Well, Andreas, thank you so much for speaking with us about all of this. We appreciate it. Andreas Thonhauser, EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And finally tonight, an update on NASA's newly launched space telescope. The James Webb Space Telescope, or JWST, has successfully fully deployed its delicate gold mirror.
About 3/4 of the way through the deployment, and everything still looks really good.
The complex maneuvers took place over the weekend. JWST required special engineering for its mirror to unfold to its full 21-foot length. As the mission proceeds, the telescope's first deep space images are expected sometime this summer. That is incredible. And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.